Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I am joined by a New York Times bestselling author who has been called one of the most imaginative writers of thrillers by the Chicago Tribune. His novel, The Killer's Game, is now a major motion picture from Lionsgate Entertainment starring Dave Bautista. He's also the co-author of the blockbuster Walking Dead novels, as well as more than 50 acclaimed short stories and 15 original novels and nonfiction works. His books and stories have been translated into 17 languages. That's right, it's your favorite writer of mine, Jay Bonansinga. Did I pronounce that right, Jay? I forgot to
Yeah,
ask.
yeah, you
Jay
did. You did.
Bonansinga. Okay. Now, when did you drop the R? Because my wife and I watched Killer's Game last night because I listened to the book and there was an R, but I feel like now you're not publishing with an R, correct?
Correct.
So
I
we'll get into
started
that. So
out.
we'll get into that.
Yeah, yeah, right. There is kind of a funny story about that.
So, all right. So, Jay, so thank you so much for making time today
Thank you for having
to
me.
chat. Oh, absolutely. So,
Fantastic.
um, and again, when I had reached out to you, you were very kind because I threw in there that many years ago you had read like I think it was like my first novel, then provide a blurb because I had this genius idea that oh, you know what, when I was looking for an agent, maybe I can get some writers and get some blurbs from, and that would help me. And it's one of those stupid things that writers tell themselves. But you were kind enough to read the book. You provided a blurb, and the book eventually
Yeah.
came out. I ended up putting it out, and obviously the blurb is on there. So thank you. Now you said you remembered. I call BS on on you
I,
remembering
I
reading
didn't
that book.
remember. I'll be completely forthright and honest. I didn't remember the book itself, but I remembered your name. You have a great writer's name.
Thank you.
Now, what
It's
is your
long
real
though.
name?
It is long though. I tell me and Dwayne Swarzinski kind of joke about how we kind of got cursed with these really long names because you
Right.
find out in publishing, really the shorter the name the better because it can be
Yeah.
much bigger
Right.
on the cover. You want a short name because the publisher can make it so much bigger, and with a
Right.
long name, it's you got to squeeze it in there. So
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
right, well
Yeah.
let's get into it. So
I tell
you've
people
written.
that I'm a blurb slut. I'll blurb.
Well, I appreciate it. I remember receiving that, and I was blown away. And so again, thank you very much.
Oh,
I owe you a drink one of these days
my
whenever we
pleasure.
meet in
My
person.
pleasure.
So let's get into your very. What was your very first novel?
The Black Mariah.
Black
Um,
Mariah. That's right. So was that your first like published novel, or was that your first novel?
that's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that. That was not my first novel. I had tons of crappy stuff that I sent out and got rejection letters. And, but the Black Mariah really started my career. And I just thought, oh, it's going to be all downhill from here because, there was a bidding war on it. Not that it was a huge hit, but it was, really a good seller for a paperback original with a foil cover, which
Mm.
I figured I've arrived. I've got that foil cover that I
So
always wanted with the demonic child on the, in the
right, and can you explain to people because obviously nowadays, I would say ebooks have kind of become the new mass market paperback.
right,
Back in the
right.
90s, 80s and 90s, can you discuss the
Yeah.
importance of the foil
The
cover?
80s, yeah, the 80s really were a boom in a lot of things, but both foil covers and the horror genre, especially for paperback originals. And they sold, mine sold 70,000 copies in the first run. It was pretty crazy back then. And and I joined the Horror Writers Association, and I would meet, my heroes, Peter Straub and you know uh, Etchison and all these huge iconic people of the 80s horror movement and all the different subgenres, and they influenced me, but you know the foil cover was sort of like this sort of little guilty pleasure of horror writers because they're in the old days there were spinner racks everywhere with new paperback originals and bus depots and drugstores, and it was amazing. Um, and so when the Black Mariah came out, uh, you know, I I'd only been married for a couple of years to my ex-wife, um, which is a side story. But at the time, her parents came over and I had just received the flat. It's another thing that we talk about as authors. You get
Yeah,
the
the flat.
flat of the cover and you look at it and go, my God, I've arrived. I exist. This is, amazing. It's such a great feeling because you've been struggling for years, probably, if you're like me, and the old cliche about getting, rejection letters and papering your wall with them. It's true. Um, and I started out just selling short stories to, uh, fantasy and science fiction and Twilight Zone magazine and stuff like that. And there was a big market for them back then. It's amazing how things have changed. But I got an agent and he sold to Black Mariah. He got a bidding war going for it. It was published by Warner Books finally. It was sold to New Line Cinema. They bought the rights to it. They called us up one day and said, because it was a supernatural horror story. It was a perpetual motion story. It was these two truckers that are cursed by this. It was sort of a Rube Goldberg, one event leading to another, but they got infected by this curse and they couldn't stop. And if they stopped moving, they would get violently ill. And if they kept stop moving, they would burst into flames and burn up. And so they had to stay moving. And I researched cross-country truck drivers in that era, and they drove a cab called a coffin box, which I have to name one of the sections of the book Coffin Box, but it was kind of fascinating. It had a sleeper in back. They just drove constantly, 24 hours, 7 days a week, and went back and forth from one end of the country to the other. And they get this curse, and they can't stop. And so New Line says, we'd like to send this to George Romero. Is that all right? And I'm like,
Is that all right?
all right? Is this a joke? Am I being punked? And George loved it. And George is like, yeah, I'm in. Let's do it. And it was green lit. And then I'm going to tell the end of this story. And then, I got to meet George and his wife, Chris, and they were super cool people. They were like old hippies, old stoners, and they were so fun to be around. And I got to stay at his place and work with him on the screenplay adaptation. It was a dream come true. Then I learned the real, gestalt of the Hollywood experience because we're sitting there one day and the phone rings and the producer's there and he answers the phone and he goes, "No, I haven't heard of that. Where is it at? Paramount? And it's in pre-pro. Okay, okay, yeah, okay. I'll ask the guys. So he hangs up and he goes, "Has anybody heard of a movie called Speed?" And I knew then that it was over. And
Shoot.
to be honest, I was so young and I was so new to the field that it didn't hurt that bad because I was like, this was such a great experience, to hang out with George Romero and get to know him and seeing, what a cool guy he was. And he lived in Sanibel Island, Florida, and he had this really cool spread. And, you know, it was just an amazing experience. And that's how my career started. I mean, from then on, it was like just survival, up and down, roller coaster, you know. Like every other person who's had a long career, it's just feast and
Yeah,
famine.
yeah, no, I mean, why I find it interesting about your and when I talk to writers who have had the longevity that you've had, recently I talked to Joseph Finder and Tess Garrett, and it's like, I mean, they've been publishing because there have been a lot of writers, and I'm sure you've experienced this too,
Most
that have
of,
just come
most
and
of it's
gone.
helped me along the way.
Yeah, I mean, but like a lot of writers just come and gone. I mean, I love used bookstores, but in many ways it's also depressing because you will like
Yes.
find these hardcovers that were published by Random House, and there's like five or six novels of a writer that you probably have never even heard of, or like,
Right.
because like
Right.
they just sort of disappear, and then you realize
Yeah.
it's like, oh my God, this is going to happen to me one day. And but I
Right.
mean, so how
Right.
old were you then when the Black Mariah was published?
I was like 30.
30, Jesus.
Yeah.
So yeah, you were definitely young at the time. So And then what year was that?
Well, the all the work on the screenplay happened before the book was published. So it was 93.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so 93 was when, we started developing the film and everything. Um, like I said, it was so different. It was such a different time because
Oh, yeah.
it was nominated for a Stoker, a first novel Stoker. So I went to New York, and that year the Stoker Awards, the keynote speaker was John Carpenter. And
Not
it was
shabby.
it was just like a dream I was having, and I didn't want to wake up. And so, later after the ceremonies and stuff, we were at the on the penthouse of this great grand old hotel in New York, and John Carpenter's there. So I got up the nerve to go up to him and start talking to him. And what a cool guy he is too, by the way. Romero, Carpenter, these people that make bone-chilling horror are the sweetest, kindest. Night. In fact, I've found that over the years, even working for The Walking Dead, the people that play, the skankiest villains are just the sweetest people that you want to hang out with. And I said to John Carpenter, um, I went to film school. My dream is to become a director. And he looks at me and goes, "Why?" I'll never forget that. For some reason, that has stuck with me over the years because I have directed a couple things, and I know exactly what he meant. I know exactly
Yeah.
what he.
Yeah. And I definitely want to talk about that. So let's go back a little bit further in terms of like, was it always horror? I mean, was that the very first thing like when you were writing the short
Yeah,
stories? Because I remember some of your short
absolutely.
stories. In fact, I think one of those you made into a movie. What was it?
Yeah,
Stash? Because that was in Cemetery
it's not
Dance, right?
cemetery dance story. Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I don't remember if I read it in the actual magazine or was it in one of like the little like because there was like
It
that
was
I remember
collected in a couple of books. Yeah, it's
in
it.
like an anthology. It was like the best of
Yep,
Cemetery Dance. I forget what
yep.
was it. Rock had put them out as trade paperbacks, I think.
It's
Or
very
but anyway,
good.
and it was just a really fascinating idea where basically it was like when someone would die, these guys kind of were hired preemptively to come into their home to basically clear out their porn stash. And in
Right.
this particular instance, they find more than porn and it becomes a whatever else. And I remember just always being a really clever idea. And then you turned it into a movie. I remember I didn't see the movie. I saw the trailer, I think either on IMDb or YouTube,
Yeah, it's
which
on IMDb. Yeah,
it's filmed. And I understand why you did this because it was probably a little bit easier, but you filmed it kind of like as a documentary in a
yeah.
way.
Right. Wow, you did your homework.
Yeah, I know. So, but like, so yeah, so was horror always, because some writers they start out, they get inspired to do one type of genre, or they get, they start. I mean, even for me, like, like I grew up, reading Stephen King. I saw a lot of my earlier
Right.
stuff, and reading Cemetery Dance, reading you, and a bunch of like, so like a lot of my earlier stuff was very supernatural horror, but then I don't know. I really started gravitating away, realizing that I guess my true passion was more kind of like thriller crime. And so
Mhm.
that's just what I kind of do now. But like, that was like, so for you, was it always horror from the very beginning?
Sometimes it's hard to define horror. I had to do that for this class I teach at DePaul, and I thought about it for weeks. I was like, what's the difference between like, Silence of the Lambs or when I was a kid, I loved this author called Trevanian. I don't know if you've
Hmm.
ever heard of him.
Shabuti, or
Yeah,
what,
right,
what's his name?
Shabubi. Yeah,
What's the, yeah.
yeah. He's like my favorite novel that he wrote was called The Eiger Sanction. It was it's incredible concept premise, that just sunk a hook into you and you couldn't put it down and everything. So it wasn't always just horror, but I will admit, when I was very young, in grade school, I would go to B. Dalton booksellers and go to the horror section because in those days there was a horror section, and I would see these reprints of At the Mountains of Madness and um various Cthulhu mythos stories and stuff, and they had these lurid covers with like, a person screaming with worms coming out of their scalp, and it really appealed to me as a kid. It's a primal thing, and Twilight Zone. Well, I'm old enough so that I was I really was, I was influenced before Stephen King, it's it's like BC, before Christ, before Stephen King. And that was, I loved Rod Serling in the Twilight Zone, and I love those Lovecraft reprints. Um, I can't even remember the publisher. You're very literate about that. You probably remember. It was like an Ace or somebody like that.
Was it
Would
Dell?
Dell, I think, yeah, I think it was. I think it was Dell. And they had, they branded them. They had this, this look and everything. Um, yeah, so yes, the short answer is it's always been horror. And if you're wondering how I defined it for my students,
Yeah, absolutely.
I had to come up with something, because especially today, with that's my cat, and she actually loves these. She gets a lot out of them. But
Yeah.
she comments during them.
The more the merrier. That's fine.
um yeah, writers and their cats. um yeah, so I'm like, okay, well, there's so many venues, there's so many hybrid stories and books and films and limited series going on, that you go, well, that's kind of horror, but not really. Yeah. And so what I came up with was, it's horror if the stakes are so high that you are risking a fate worse than death. That's my definition of horror. Possession, haunting, being turned into a monster. That you could sort of bullet point all the situations that would be worse than death, torture, porn, and that's horror. That's why I think Silence of the Lambs does edge over the line from, a procedural into horror, because Hannibal Lecter says to Clarice Starling, and this is kind of the turning point of the whole book and film, you know, um, I'll help you catch him, Clarice. Quid pro quo. You tell me something personal about yourself, and I'll tell you how to catch Buffalo Bill. And what that was a fate worse than death. Because if you let Hannibal Lecter into your head, you're going to be tortured, and death might be the only relief. And she's warned, by Jack Crawford, her boss, the section chief. She's warned about that. You know, don't let Hannibal Lecter get into your head. You don't
Yeah.
want, never forget what he is. And she's like, what is he? And in the film we cut right to the insane asylum, and Chilton says, "Oh, he's a monster. It's so rare to have one in captivity." End of scene.
All right. So with the short story, do you remember how old you were when you wrote your first shorts? I mean, like, I guess at
Yeah,
what point
I
did
do.
was there a certain book or story, or what was the inspiration for you to decide that writing was something that you wanted to potentially make a career? Because a
Great
lot of
question.
people don't,
Yeah,
start out, they go to, they have other, I guess, aspirations, but I mean, sometimes like there's a demented part of in a lot of us where
yeah,
we're just like, oh, we can tell these stories for a living, and it's like
that's really
it's
true.
crazy if you think about it. But I mean, yeah. So like, do you remember what specifically was that kind of pushed you in that direction?
That's really, really well said, because, you don't when you fall in love with it as a kid, you don't realize, oh, I could do this. This is like anything else, there's an apprenticeship, that there's things to learn, and you could actually get paid for it. Harlan Ellison used to say, there's a there's a secret that all us professional writers know. Uh, and I'm going to tell it to you now, he says to his audience at a convention or whatever. I'm going to tell it to you now, and I'm not supposed to. I signed an NDA, but there is a secret among all us professional writers, and I will tell you the secret so that you can go and maybe become a professional. Here's the secret. We get paid for our work. So it was to answer your question, it was when I was a freshman in high school. There, one of my English teachers, and it does often come down to a really great English teacher. I've asked other authors this, and you probably have too, you know. But she said we're having a contest, a short story contest. I'm like, really? Wow, great. I'm going to enter it, you know. And I entered it and I got like second place, but it was just that little paper with the little ribbon and everything in second place for this story that was basically and to further answer your question, it was a pastiche. It was just a copy of Bradbury. It was, I remember it vividly. I probably still have it
Do you still have it?
somewhere. I probably still have it. I do
Yeah.
keep all these things. I am a pack rat and OCD, but it was just a simple story of these space travelers visiting Earth after the human race has died out, and they visit Earth, which is now a museum. And it was just a Bradbury-esque story. It wasn't exactly horror, but it was, and that was it. That was it. From that point on, that's what I wanted to do. I started, writing. Most of the stuff I wrote throughout high school was just I was copying stuff. I would literally copy stuff sometimes. I would copy Trevanian, the Lou Sanction. I became obsessed with assassins, for some reason. Like, much of this no one can really explain, you know, unless they're in heavy therapy. But to this day, I'm still writing about hitmen and contract killers. I don't know what it was, but you know, but horror really was the engine inside me. It was just horror. I made little Super 8 horror films when I was in college. I saw Eraserhead when it first came out. That's how old I am. I'm really dating myself. People could figure it out. It's not really hard math to figure out how old I am. But seeing Eraserhead also was another quantum leap. It changed my life. All these works that and experiences I had changed my life. So I really share what you said a few minutes ago with you. I you know, I really loved thrillers. I loved suspense. Even when I was like 9 years old, my mom and grandma would let me stay up late and watch the late night movie. And I remember the movies that I saw that warped me and haunted me, like whatever happened to Baby Jane, weird just thrillers that some of them are horrific. I mean, but I, Hitchcock, I just really absorbed that stuff as a kid. So that's kind of what I started spitting out when I was in college is sort of, emulating that stuff and sending it out to little, small press and, magazines that you could find on newsstands, in the mail, in the snail mail, and waiting for that
Mm.
form letter to come back.
Who won the Stoker that year that you were nominated?
Oh, great, great question. Yeah, I should know the answer to that if I had any memory left. Probably
Uh,
now after so
It
much
was
reading.
Bentley Little or something.
Yeah, very, very good.
Was
Very
it?
good. I think it was. I'm trying to think of what it
Wow.
would have been for though. Maybe
Well, his
university.
first novel was The Revelation. I remember that. I
That
remember
might have
that
been
had won
it.
the
That might
Stoker,
have
but I
been it.
forget which year specifically. Well, okay, so after that, okay, so that was your first novel. What was your follow-up then?
It's called Sick.
Sick.
And
And that was
I
another horror,
yeah,
paperback original
it
horror.
was it was a paperback original horror book. Yep.
And then what was your next one after that? Because I want to get to the Killer's Game, but I think the Killer's Game
Yep.
came what, third or fourth?
Third, The Killer's Game was after Sick. I, you know,
Okay.
I, I was jumping into a new genre. It was very formative time for me because the two paperback originals did pretty well. And also they each sold, I don't know, on an average, like a half a dozen foreign editions. And as you know, in those days, you could live off that money.
Hmm.
They would sell a foreign edition. The advance was like 2,500 bucks or something, or 3,000 bucks. But if you sold like a half a dozen on a little paperback original, you could actually have a decent little middle class living. So, I was spoiled. I got used to it, and I'm like I said to my agent at the time, who has been my agent for 30 years. He passed away a couple years ago, but I said to him at the time, um, I'm thinking about writing, a crime thriller, not the genre of horror. And he goes, well, you can forget about Warner Books then. And I'm like, oh, really? Because they once they sell a few books and you're in this given genre, they're very unlikely to go, yeah, go ahead. So, it was destined to happen because I had this idea and I wrote it out. It's a little pitch, and I remember pitching it to my agent and his creative director, and they both were like, I think we could sell that thing you're reading to us. I'm like, seriously? And they went, no, seriously, I think we could sell that document, that 3 paragraph pitch. And they did. They ended up, that's how, it was my cash cow idea. I've never had been stricken with that kind of lightning before in my life and never since. It was just that one idea of this. It's been copied endlessly for 30 years. I mean, I could name the John Wick is the latest, series that I'm not saying John Wick like literally copied my book, but it floated around for 30 years. So this idea, but at the time in 94, it was fairly new, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. You might be able to tell me whether this had been done before, but you know,
I can't, I mean, I haven't read every
I say,
single like
yeah, Donald
assassin book
was
out there,
playing.
but so actually, obviously we wouldn't keep talking about this, but I actually want to jump back. So with your agent for the first novel, when you what was that process like? Because every writer has a different type of process and they go through because it's a grueling process of trying to get an agent.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
where like you're just
Yeah.
sending out queries, and then there's some agents that want to take like the first 50 pages, and then it
Oh,
takes
you're
them
right.
5 months because I think my most recent, I mean, I've gone through now, like I think I'm on my third agent, and that's another thing too. I mean, you had your agent for so long because sometimes it's a great working relationship. Other times it's just,
Yeah,
I got right out of college, I got my first agent. Again, I
yeah,
thought I was going to be like, okay, I'm going to sell a book. This is it.
right.
And then it's just like, and it becomes a thing that you also learn that a lot of books that get rejected are not rejected because they're bad books. It's
Right.
just, an editor might be like, I really like this, but it's not right for this line, or
Right.
we're publishing something very similar in the next 6 months, and blah blah blah. And I don't know. I mean, and especially like your agent who had that connection. So you talked about like the creative director. I mean, who had that kind of because I almost feel like you were a writer that essentially like everything you publish you got optioned, which a lot of writers have
Almost.
stuff that gets
Yeah,
optioned, but
almost.
it's also very rare that literally like every single thing like gets optioned like you. I mean, yeah, I mean, like how did that come about with was it P Peter Miller?
Wow. Yes.
I have
Well
a weird
done.
brain for some of this stuff. Like some people watch baseball and know stats
Like
from
a
players back
savant.
in the 60s. For me, it's like I literally would know like different writers and their agents and their editors for yeah, it was pretty sick to be honest with you.
Yeah, I'm totally impressed. And yeah, Peter Miller, it is an interesting story if you're out there now trying to build a career and find an agent. It goes back to me, watching as a kid, watching The Twilight Zone, and this dude would come out at the beginning of each episode. Again, you all my Gen Z students are like, "Who's this now? And what's it called? And what's TV? What exactly is that?" But uh, Rod Serling would introduce the stories, in his sharp, skinny lapel black suit, with the skinny tie. And he'd be smoking. He's like, submitted for your approval. And but God, he seduced me as a kid. And I remember my mom saying, well, he writes some of those stories. And that was another building block to my desire. But by the time I graduated and got my master's from film school, by that point, I was like, all I could think about was I want to become a professional. And in order to do that, I have to be, I can get the skinny tie and I can get the black suit, but I need an agent. That is the true mark of a professional. So I just madly started sending out queries to agencies. And I remember one time okay, I got 20 really good ones that, work with horror authors that I admire. They're in New York. I had these like sort of, it was almost like Tinder. I wanted a date, but I had this like all these like things, this criteria. So that I wanted one in New York, and I wanted one that handled really top-notch writers that I identified with. And I got back 20 rejections. I remember after all that work, I got back 20 rejections. But the 20th rejection was from this guy, Peter Miller. And it was so comprehensive, the rejection. It wasn't a form letter. It was a typed letter, that said, we're going to pass on this, Jay, on both your works. I sent him a screenplay and a novel, because in those days, and that was one of my criteria, that they were more of a manager than a literary agent. Because in those days, the managers would handle both screenplay and prose fiction, and that's what I wanted to do. And his rejection was so complimentary. He's like, my creative director thinks you have a real knack for dialogue. So keep it up, keep working on it, and good luck to you. And it was really friendly. And then it also had little swag. He sent a postcard with his picture, and it was just cute, and I had a warm feeling from it. So I was so obsessed and driven. I called him immediately, and I said, look, I notice on your materials that you have a reading fee. It was something like $300 or something like that, $200. I'm like, I will wager you this reading fee that I can rewrite either one of these works or both with your notes to the point where you want to represent it. And there was this long pause. And he goes, all right, okay, send me back the stuff. Send them back to me, because they returned the stuff. And it was such a prehistoric era. But yeah, I did three more rewrites with his creative director's notes. Her name was Jennifer Robinson. She now works for Imagine Entertainment, and brilliant person. She was also a mentor of mine. And so and after the third rewrite, I went on vacation and I called in to get my messages on my answering machine. Yes, those were the days when we had answering machines. And
Well, I
push
want to talk about that when we talk about the Killer's Game, because it was one
right,
of those
right,
things where it was
right.
almost like, if I don't know, that book would
Exactly.
work today because of the answering machine.
The answering machine. And it was Jennifer Robinson on the line. I don't think she had ever called me. And I'm like, well, wow, this must be kind of news. And she goes, Jay, the eagle has landed. We're going to represent this novel. And the novel was called Pandemonium, and it was a Stephen King-esque horror novel, never sold. Never sold. But I would pitch them stuff from that point on because I really trusted them, you know. And they got me a lot of great, feedback from that novel that I wrote, Pandemonium. Um, and everybody's got drawer novels that that didn't work or whatever. I've got tons of them. I don't even know what
Were
my
you ever
odds.
tempted about putting them out?
Tempted is probably the right word, but I haven't, I mean, because I just have so much stuff going on. I'm lucky that I have an overactive imagination. But I would pitch them the Black Mariah, and they're like, "Oh yeah, 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 you should write that." And then flash forward a couple of years in '93. I guess it was '93. No, it was earlier than that. It was like maybe '91 or '92. um, I wrote the whole manuscript of the Black Mariah, and they read it and loved it and put it up for auction, sent it out, went out wide with it. And that's how I got an auction going between two publishing houses, Signet and Warner's. And then Warner's was an amazing experience because I worked with this guy named Mauro DiPreta, who was one of the best editors I've ever had. And I think now he's the head of I don't remember what imprint it is, but he's the head of a publishing house. So I've had great editors along the line, which has helped me immensely. And I remember when when the internet took over and became our computer overlord. People were going, "Oh, this is great! This internet, this web stuff, this web writing we're doing, because we eliminate the editor." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's great. Yeah, wonderful. Mazel tov. Good for you." And I'm like, "Shit's gonna start getting really bad and watering down, the field, and the consumer will have a harder time finding great stuff." That was my theory. You tell me whether that has come true.
So when you were writing the Black Maria, did you like are you somebody that outlines or do you just have that idea gonna go from there?
Yeah, I do outline.
And then has that changed over the years?
Yeah, great question. I learned from this great writer named Rick Cotala, how
Oh
important
yeah.
you remember him?
Rest in peace. Yeah.
He was a wonderful guy, and he lived in Maine, and he said, I'm the other horror writer from Maine." And he was a wonderful person, and he really showed me some of his outlines, and he explained why he outlined so much, and I really became like an acolyte of Rick's process and the process of just structure, because I started realizing, if you know what the end is of a long form narrative story, you know where to begin it, and it's magical. Like this one little thing, you figure out the ending and why that's the perfect ending, and then you go, oh, yeah, there's no other place to start it. I have to start it right here. This is like Aristotelian math. You start with the problem, and then at the end, the hero returns with the elixir and faces the problem, and it's elliptical. You know what I mean? It's like a magical thing that it was like skating on two blades. I just all of a sudden I'm like, this is how to write a book, and thus hence came the Killer's Game, because of the success of those two paperback originals. I met all these great writers, and I got to know them. And I met Harlan Ellison, and he became a friend. I remember vividly when I first met him. I'm in this long table of us sad little pathetic paperback original authors with their first book. And Harlan Ellison comes up to us, and he starts giving shit to people. And he comes up to me and he goes, "The Black Mariah. I read that. That's a decent book." I remember his exact words. "That's a decent book."
That's high
And he
praise
looks
from Harlan.
exactly. And that's I started going, "Elizabeth, I'm coming to meet you." I said, "I can't believe Harlan Ellison just said that to me." And he's standing there like that, listening to me babble. "Oh my God, thank you so much. If coming from you, and I babbled for about, a minute and a half, and he's just standing there like this, just waiting for me to take a breath. And he goes, "Look, I said it's a decent book. I didn't say it's Les Miserables."
So so were you also like also doing screenwriting? Like I mean,
Yeah,
so with the Black Mariah, when you were working with Romero, I mean, were you working on the script? Was that
yeah.
part of the deal?
Yeah, that was part of the deal. And New Line, God bless them, they were amazing in those days. They loved horror. They were founded on horror, obviously. And for the Gen Zers listening in, I'm talking about basically Nightmare on Elm Street. You know, that made that studio. So they really, into horror and they were really into high concept horror. And that's why this really worked for him. And that's why they thought of Romero. And they were absolutely right. He loved it. And I became a lifelong friend. Also, rest in peace. And my agent Peter Miller said I'm trying to think of the who the executive was. Michael DeLuca was the name of the executive. Also, I owe him a lot. Anyway. He said, "Well, Jay's also a screenwriter. He'd like to participate and have a seat at the table, or possibly co-write it." And they got back to us after a couple of days and said, "All right, Jay can be a co-screenwriter, but he has to work with a veteran. We have to assign a veteran screenwriter with him on this project." And they did, and his name was Preston Whitmore, and I learned so much from him too. I mean, I guess maybe this is I'm offering advice to up and coming, fledgling new authors, just accept every twist and turn in your career as an opportunity. Okay, no matter whether it's good or bad, look at it as an opportunity, especially when somebody says, "Okay, you can work on this, but we're going to, assign a veteran with you." And it was a great experience, man. And I got into the Writers Guild because of it. And so, everything leads to something else, and all this led to the Killer's Game, which really that was also a quantum leap. It was my first hardcover deal, my first tour that I got sent on by a publisher, Simon and Schuster. Um, and they sold it on a pitch. They bought this thing on a pitch. Simon and Schuster and Andrew Lazar, who was a hot producer at the time. In fact, he called me last year, when the film was, being shot in Budapest. I guess, yeah, it was last year. Around this time last year, it was shot in Budapest. And he goes, "You know how old I was when I bought the rights to this from you?" And he's like, "I was 27." you know, I am now 55. It was like, this is unbelievable. Um,
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the whole, I guess, Hollywood aspect of everything. And so there's this, I forget who told me, but and it's kind of depressing if you think about it. Like someone had said that you can make a very good living working in Hollywood and never have anything ever produced or ever made because like with you, I mean, you co-wrote or you were working on the script. I'm assuming you got a separate fee for working on a script that eventually was never even made.
right. Black Mariah, I went from, um, just struggling and living from paycheck to paycheck and doing odd work. I never was not a writer. When I went to school, I got a degree in English. I started writing circulars for newspapers. I started writing advertising. I started writing business communication, business theater. Um, I wrote for uh, an association of crazy insurance salesmen called the $1 Million Round Table. And it was good for me. It was, everything I tell people, I tell my students, anytime you can string two words together for a buck, you're going to get better. You're going to get better at your craft, no matter how insipid it might seem to you, and writing about insurance, is not exactly, writing, Citizen Kane, but, but, it really helped me. And that old adage that you just said a minute ago is true. When we learned about speed, that project was put on hold indefinitely, but I made so much money that I could work on the next book with rather, sort of ease of time, spent on it. I could spend a luxurious amount of time on it. And but it never was as true as it was with the Killer's Game, the 30-year period of development hell. Maybe
Yeah,
it was
let's
hell for somebody else, but
yeah,
it,
no, well, let's talk about that. And that is something also worth noting for some writers who want to want to dabble in film, TV. A writer I know, I don't want to name him, but he had said that, one of his books was optioned by two different studios. And part of it was they said that, the writer wanted to write the script and only one of the studios was on board with that. So obviously they went with that studio. But what you get from that is, again, you could potentially get a lot more money just writing that first draft. I mean, they might not even go with it, but you're still getting
Right.
paid to write it. And so it's a
Yeah.
separate deal. And again, it's one of those things where it's
Right.
just like, you know, writers essentially, I mean, we don't have we essentially do like work for hire, it's usually
Yeah.
by book or whatever else. So we never know what's going to happen in a year.
Yeah. Right.
Hopefully it's nice when we have a two-book deal, but there might not be another deal after that two-book deal. So really it's trying to get money wherever you can. And,
Right. Right.
especially
Right.
like nowadays, like a lot of writers try to get on as like producers, as consulting producers, as EPs or whatever else, just because they're a little bit more attached. And if something does happen, there's those producer fees that they're going to kind of keep
Right.
coming in. And
Yeah.
so it's always just trying to
Absolutely.
kind of keep that money rolling in. So yeah, so the Killer's Game, you sell it on a pitch, which is insane
I
because
know.
I
I
mean,
know.
oftentimes publishers want to really kind of at least see a good
Yeah.
chunk of the book
Right.
before they can make an offer or
Right.
whatever else. So okay, so it's amazing that you sell it on a pitch. At what point now, so I listened to the audiobook that had just recently come out, and you actually provide the afterword. It's in the paperback as well, but in the audiobook, it's actually you reading it. And I believe you had mentioned that obviously, as soon as it got sold on the pitch, you guys were shopping it around Hollywood, and so it was already in production even before the book came out.
Yes. Yes. As a matter of fact, and also the decisions that we made, when I say we, I'm talking about myself with my advisors, my manager, my agent, but you know and Andrew Lazar is such a friendly, warm, kind of cool dude who just wants to talk story and just loves movies. And I instantly thought this guy's really the right person for this. This is going to be in the right hands. And I haven't even written, the entire book yet. And this guy just gets it and everything. So I developed this really good relationship with him. And then he said, I'd like to bring in a screenwriter. His name is Rand Ravitch, and Rand Ravitch was also the same kind of vibe, and so I'm like, cool. Well, I have my hands full with this book. I'm just going to let this go and be the source material because I want this book to be great. So that it was a intuitive decision. So, and I was already in the Writers Guild, and I'm like, there'll be plenty of screenplays. I'm just going to be the source material. And when I told them that, I think they felt empowered then to call me up and give me ideas. And again, I say, for some reason, I was just like cool with that. I'm working in a field that I've dreamt of working in since I was a freshman in high school. What's not to love? So I'm listening to them, and they came up with this one third act idea for the Killer's Game. I'm like, oh my God, that's genius. I'm putting that in. I'm putting that in the book. I hadn't written the third act yet, and they're sort of developing the third act of the screenplay. And Rand's kind of, structuring it out. And he came up with this, it follows the hero's journey weirdly, like very subtly and beneath the surface, and you never guess that, but it follows the hero's journey just beautifully, and it's that third act bump, and I could not believe how good an idea it was. So I put that in the book. So I felt like it was a collaboration in both directions, because I when I this is how long ago I wrote that that pitch. I saw Jack Nicholson as as Joe Flood, the hitman, because in 1993, Nicholson was, you know, he was robust. He was a burly, super sexy, crazy dude. People would have bought it in 93, you know. I read the description now and I'm thinking, I wouldn't have thought of a pro wrestler But
No, I thought Dave Bautista did a great job. So, but let me ask you this: the original screenwriter. Well, he's not
Brent,
listed as at all. I mean, like how many scripts have gone through in the
well,
30 some
yeah,
years? I mean, how many
that's
iterations? And I guess my question is because
I can't believe how many there
watching,
were.
I mean, yeah, like watching the movie. I watched my wife and I watched the movie last night, and I had just listened to the book, so I had it fresh in my mind of what the book was and what the movie was. And in a way, I'm reminded very much of like the first Jason Bourne movie,
Yeah,
where
that's
that
astute.
movie is nothing like the book. You know what I mean? If you
Right,
take the
right,
book, you can
yeah,
see where the jumping off,
right,
point is. And like, there's a little things here and there that are like, some of the characters, of course, Treadstone, but
yeah,
like literally nothing else is like that. And that's very much like this. Like, we had Joe Flood and we had Maisie, and he's an assassin, but like everything else is completely different. So like that initial screenplay, was it very similar to the book, or were they just
yeah.
kind of using that as like a jumping off point?
Yeah, it's very convoluted, obviously, because it's been 30 years. I mean, I haven't counted them up, but there's been, I'm not exaggerating, there's probably been 20 different screenwriters in and out, tw maybe 20 iterations of the screenplay itself. I mean, one that I remember was Nick Cassavetes, who is John Cassavetes' son. He wrote the weirdest one. He, I mean, it was crazy. It was trippy. It was, the Sabatini brothers are in the original novel, and they're like Sicilian, hitmen, and they're twins. They were conjoined twins, and then they were, and so
At any point,
Cassavetes.
did you throw your hat in the ring to also write, to try to adapt it yourself?
No, no. Like I said, I was so busy with the book, and then I wanted to tour with the book, and I thought the movie
Well,
would
I
be
meant just over the years, over the
yeah.
last like
Over
30
the
some years.
years, I thought of jumping in, but every couple of years, you know, uh, Peter would call me up and said, "Hey, I just got word from Andrew. Um, Jason Statham is signed on to be Joe Flood." I'm like, Jason Statham? Okay. And I just wanted to watch it. I don't know
Yeah,
what, it's funny. It's kind of ironic that I chose that one to just sit out and not get involved in the adaptation. But
it worked
you
out.
yeah, yeah,
So, and then, so for people who aren't aware, I mean, the way the Hollywood, so, okay, so can you discuss, just the whole, and this isn't always the same for every single book, but oftentimes, a book gets optioned by a studio, by a producer, by whoever. And what that really means is they're optioning it for a certain amount of time. And usually it's like with some type of like monetary, it
right,
might be X number of
right,
dollars.
right,
And then if they actually it goes into production or whatever else, you get a lot more.
right.
Whereas opposed to, but at the very least, and some writers have just basically like kind of lived off these options because some of these studios or whatever will just keep optioning it,
That's me.
every whatever the options up, and it could be a nice chunk of change that's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
coming in, and essentially the studio is optioning it. Sometimes the studios do this, and it's really a dick move where they're optioning it because they don't want anybody else to have it. They might
right,
not even do anything with it. They might not have any
right.
plans. I think I've heard that from some writers where it's like
Yeah,
they eventually got out of it because they could tell that the studio they didn't really want anything to do with it. They just didn't want anybody else to have it.
yeah,
But
that's
um, but
true.
again, it's just money coming in. So for 30 or for however long, I mean, can you like talk about that process where just like, and then have you ever had any other projects that have also been optioned as long?
No, like I said, over the 30 some books that, you know, novels, long form books that I've written, um, almost, I would say like 75% of them have been an option. But, each option is very different. Options are sort of like, um, fluid and made up on the spot and in different ways. The option for the Killer's Game was engineered by a bunch of very honest, very, cool people who had my best interest in mind. So I had bonuses built into it that came back and paid me, but I had also purchase prices that you're talking about. So every year for, probably a couple of decades, every year or every 18 months, depending on the new option language, because they would have to sort of give you an addendum when they re-option it. So anyway, let's say you're lucky enough that I was when I sold the rights to the Killer's Game to a person like Andrew. He would not give up. And even when it was sold to a different studio, which happened years into the development, he would stick with it, be the overseer, and I would get a call in December from my agent at CAA, and he'd go, "Jay, I've got some good news. I'm looking at a check for $30,000 on my desk with your name on it." And I'd be like, "What?" you know, and he's like, "Yeah, they're re-optioning the Killer's Game." And so that went on, like I said, for maybe, I don't know, 15 years or so, until finally, because the way that these deals are engineered, like I said, it's kind of convoluted, but there's an option amount for a certain amount of time, okay? And sometimes it's applicable to the purchase price. Sometimes it's not. And in our case, like I said, Peter Miller was a genius in sort of building in bonuses and stuff and making little, changes to the, contracts to benefit his authors. So he built in a thing that's, the third option is not applicable to the purchase price. The sixth option is not applicable to the, in case this starts getting re-optioned. And that started happening. So I would get free money in a way, passive income, because eventually one day, maybe 20 years into the development hell that I was in, um, Peter called me up and said, "I got unbelievable news. They're purchasing your book." And I'm like, "Are the cameras rolling?" He goes, "No, I don't even think they're any closer to that. But they've decided to purchase the rights with the remaining what they owe us." So they purchased the book. I've never heard of that happening to anybody, but they gave me what they were supposed to give me when the cameras rolled, as you said a minute ago. You outlined the process very well. There's this option amount, which is like maybe 10 or 15% of the total purchase price. Even today, it's in the six figures usually. Sometimes it's even in the millions. It depends on who you are and how your books have sold, and But in my case, it was mid six figures. And so there was a lot of money left on that they hadn't paid out, and they paid me that whole amount. And that was maybe, I don't know, that was back in like, of course, I've spent all this money, every last penny I'm talking about.
Yeah. So, all
But
right. So, have
there was even
you,
a bonus. I'll just add one more thing.
yeah.
Peter added a production bonus for me. It's unbelievable. He goes, "This is a production bonus. So when the cameras roll, whether they've paid the whole amount on the book or not, okay, Jay gets a bonus if the budget, the final budget is above 25 million." In 93, that was
Yeah.
a
Nowadays, that's everything is like at least probably 50 million.
so I
Jesus.
got this huge bonus last year, from and I called Steve Richards, who's one of the co-producers, with Endeavor, and I'm like, "Can I know you don't want to talk about the budget and everything, but can I just ask you how much of that, bonus that I get?" And there's a long pause, and then he says, "The maximum." I'm like, "You're kidding me." And so there was a ceiling. Peter Miller couldn't say, no matter how high it goes, Jay
Yeah.
gets an extra, $5,000 for every million it goes above 25, million. But in today's world, if you're shooting a film with Ben Kingsley and this, all the, these stars, and you're shooting it in Budapest, I knew it was above 25 million. you
Oh,
know,
yeah.
how much, I don't know. I think it was, somewhere between like 35 and 45 million, something like that. But they don't like to talk about it. I get that. I understand that.
Yeah.
But he even
S-
had that. That's why you need an agent. What's the
So,
lesson
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we're coming up on the hour. I mean, we have so much more. I mean, I don't think we are going to get to The Walking Dead. Hopefully, we'll have to have another
Part
chat
two.
sometime in the
Yeah,
future,
we could
and
do
because that's
part
definitely
two.
going to be interesting to talk about. But let's stick with the Killer's Game. Did you, um, so as these scripts were coming in, like, I mean, were they just kind of passing and being like, "Hey, FYI," or like, were you providing feedback on them?
I was providing feedback, and I loved every one of them, even the weird, trippy, one that Nick Cassavetes wrote. I thought this isn't anything, as you said, this is nothing like my book. But I would go watch this. I would go watch it. A group of Sicilian hit people who are circus, clowns and circus acrobats and stuff. It was just the trippiest thing. And I'm like, I would watch that. I totally would watch that. And that's how I felt with the final film. I wanted to see it with um I wanted to see it with the cast at the premiere. I didn't want to see it before that. I didn't want to read it because they went back to Rand's original screenplay, and which was the most, faithful to my book. And then they just brought in one writer. So the two writers that got credit at the end were Rand and this guy James Coyne, who was like a comedy specialist, and they wanted to pump up the comedy in it. So he took Rand's the basic spine of the story was Rand's faithful screenplay. And then one reason you might say it's like nothing like your book, they set it in Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
so that changed a lot. That changed, a lot of detail and stuff. But the beats are still totally in the right place and right from my book. The beat when he learns he has a terminal illness, the beat when he decides he's got to break up with Maisie and he's throwing everything away and he's putting a hit on himself, the beat where Maisie rescues him, where, blah blah blah. It's just they're all in the right place and everything. So my wife and I were just like, this is crazy. It's nothing like your book, but man, it's a fun movie, and it's a popcorn movie.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the heart and soul of the book is there. And again, I
Yeah.
thought Dave Bautista did a really great job because he has that genuine, he's very genuine, I mean, and it
Yeah.
just felt
But
that yeah.
he
So
he
did you go
underplayed.
visit set at all when they were
No,
filming?
I didn't get over to Budapest. I couldn't. I was busy, trying to finish this book that I finished recently. And I had gone to Italy the previous year, and I was inspired because we stayed for 4 days in Taormina, Sicily, and my family's from Sicily. My dad's side of my family is from Sicily, and I'd never been there, and I was haunted and obsessed and fascinated by Sicily. So this book I just finished is called The Cleaning Woman. It's based it's based on my experiences in Sicily in terms of inspiration. Um, and it does involve a hit person.
Very,
I know you'd
very
never
cool.
guess that, but
Well, I mean, because you jump back and forth in terms of genres. I mean, for a while, obviously, and again, we don't really have time now, but hopefully sometime in the future we can chat more about how you got into just The Walking Dead. You've written, your several Walking Dead books. But I do want to ask you for the time remaining with The Killer's Game. Now, it was re-released as a paperback and obviously audiobook, ebook. Um, for a novel, I mean, do you ever then like were you tempted to just kind of like read through it again and maybe try to like, because like I guarantee you, I mean, there's probably stuff I wrote like 2 years ago. I could go back through it and be like,
you're
this
right.
line, I really probably shouldn't use this word. I mean, like
That's
or like, is it the
yeah.
same exact book that was published back in the 90s?
Well, not exact because William Morrow, it's a fabulous publisher. I mean, they're one of the great publishers I think still around. Um, they did a I'm trying to think of a politically correct word.
Oh, did they do a
They did a
sensitivity read?
woke they did a woke edit.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Jay, you know what? You should not use. I mean, I think one of them that really amused me was, you have Creighton Lovedoll, who's played by Terry Crews in the movie. Also, that character is completely lifted right from the book. He does exactly the same things. His name is the same. He looks just like that. I loved Terry Crews in the role. Ice Cube was going to play it originally, and he fell out. And so Terry Crews, I thought he was amazing in it. And the minute he shows up in the film, he's wearing like this fake, work dungaree that says, love doll cleaning and air conditioning, heating and air conditioning on the back. And my wife and I just giggled at the premiere because that name, Creighton Lovedoll, was my grandma's accountant. And I just, that's what I do. I hear names and I'm like, oh God, I love that name, Creighton Lovedoll. So that's like an actual guy. And anyway, I forgot the question. What was the question? I'm sorry.
Well, we were talking about how I guess William Morrow did sensitivity reader or
Oh
whatever.
yeah, the
So like the
sensitivity.
book is a little bit different than if someone found like a
Yeah,
hardcover version
yeah.
from the 90s.
Yeah, they're like, you shouldn't use the word cracker anymore. I'm like, really? Cracker? Really?
Out of all the words, I feel like cracker is probably the least
That was the least.
yeah.
That was the least troubling one in my original draft. There were many, so that was a sensitivity edit, and it was great. It was fine. That we also took we didn't take out the phone booths and the answering machine
I mean, you
and
really couldn't because it was one of those things where again, I feel like if you were to do that novel nowadays, with cell phones or whatever else. I mean, they
yeah,
kind of did it in the movie in a way to kind of explain how he doesn't get the news right away that,
right,
with the mix up. But again, I mean, back then, I mean, you could think about a lot of movies or even TV shows where if it was made today with smartphones, it's like this would not work at all. I mean,
right, yeah,
remember the movie Colin Farrell Phone Booth?
yeah.
Like, there's
Oh,
just yeah, there's just or like
yeah,
even
yeah,
I love Robert Crace, like a lot of early Elvis Cole books where, he has to, they have to find a payphone and call somebody. And yeah,
right,
I mean,
right,
just,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, I love Robert Craze too. Yeah, I mean, you know, you wouldn't believe all the crazy stuff that's happened over that 30 years. Like we got a call one day from a division of Disney. I think it was called Hollywood Pictures. I don't think it's around anymore, but they had this there used to be a joke going around Hollywood, their logo was the Sphinx. I don't know if you remember that
Yeah.
if you remember that part of Disney, and everybody said, if it's the Sphinx, it stinks. But we got a call from them out of the clear blue sky one day, and it was before Andrew had finalized, his offer, and so we hadn't sold the rights to the movie. They called us up and they said, um, we'd like to offer you guys, I think it was $250,000. I think it was $250,000. We'd like to offer you guys $250,000 for the rights to the book. And my agent, Peter, is like, wow, okay, let's talk, And he goes, Jay's also a screenwriter. Can he participate in the process? And they go, oh, the screenplay's already written. And yeah, that was his reaction. And he's like,
What?
what do you mean? Yeah, what do you mean? And they said, we just want to cannibalize two scenes from the book for a movie that we have in pre-pro right now. And
Yeah.
so, you know, Peter's like, well, would Jay get credit? And they're like, oh, no, 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 no. And you can't tell anybody. And you got to take the book off the market.
What?
Yeah.
That's
And
crazy.
so, yeah. And we said, just to make a long story short, because I know we're running out of time, but we said no. And also we said no. I was young. I don't know if I would have said no now because I'm just so greedy now because I have two kids that are high, college age kids, and we live in Chicago and it's so expensive now. I might have said yes. Who knows? But at the time we said no. They used the scene anyway. I can point it out. I can go, that's the scene, and it's just set in a kitchen. The scene in my book was set on the L train. But
Wow.
that's the scene.
Yeah, that reminds me of I think Tim Powers. He had a novel that Disney used for one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
Really?
And so I believe, if I remember correctly, they basically bought the rights to the novel just to use that title, that subtitle. Um,
Wow.
I
Yeah.
think, yeah, something
They,
tides or dark tide.
yeah.
I forget, but
Right.
yeah. So, and
Yeah.
I could be wrong. I mean, I think people need to, you know what?
Well,
Let
that
me double check
happens.
here.
It happens. I never realized that it happened until that day, but I'm like, this is insane.
Yeah,
This is
on Stranger Tides.
yeah, okay.
On Stranger Tides. It was his novel. It was 1987 historical supernatural novel, and they wanted to use here it was. Let me see here. I'm on the good old Wikipedia. In 2007, after a successful opening weekend, the third blah blah blah, they were interested in a fourth film. I don't want to read the whole thing, but anyone can go online and look
Yeah.
at it. And
Yeah.
basically, they announced the fourth title would be Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. The announcements had fueled speculation among those familiar with Tim Powers' novel on Stranger Tides that the fourth Pirates movie would follow the plot of the novel. And anyway, people can read that. Yeah, but so like that happens sometimes too, where yeah, studios or whatever, for whatever reason, they just feel
Right.
like yeah, it's an insane business.
Yeah. It totally is. I mean, it's I think it's a miracle that I'm sitting here talking to you about all this stuff. The Walking Dead was another example. I know I'll just say this as a cliffhanger for maybe the next time you and I talk, but The Walking Dead was a complete, I stumbled into it and it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. It was very akin to work, hanging out with George Romero and collaborating with him on a project times 1,000, but I just stumbled into it. My agent, not Peter Miller, but my film agent at the time, Andy Cohen, he was having lunch with David DA, with the executive producer who became the executive producer of the show, and David Alpert, it was Robert Kirkman's manager and co-producer and right hand man. So he was a friend of my agent, and they're having lunch one day, and he goes, "Yeah, we're looking for a horror author." And so my agent Andy's like, "Oh, well, I represent one." His name is Jay Bonansinga. He's written several horror books. He's been nominated for awards and stuff. And so I'm thinking, oh, it's a novelization. It's in and out. It'll be, this little novelization of a zombie show, and I'll be in and out and everything. And we made the deal. And the first time I talked to Robert Kirkman, I'm like, "Are you going to send me a screenplay or a script or?" And he goes, "What? No, 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 no. That's not what this is. I want these to be like literary novels based on the backstories of some of the most important characters." I'm like, "What?" And he goes, and I didn't at that moment, I didn't know. And he goes, "It's going to be on AMC. This is not a cheesy show. This is Frank Darabont, the showrunner." I'm like,
Oh, so
"What?"
this was even before the show was
Before the
out.
show. Before
Because I
the
remember
show.
the books came out obviously after the show.
Right. But I made the deal before the show came out. And
Wow.
um and it just kept getting more and more interesting, and I'm like, holy crap, this is going to be like a phenomenon after the first season of the show, and my book hadn't come out yet. Especially with the governor. When the governor came into the into play, I had these I was kind of the caretaker of the governor's backstory. And David Morrissey at one of the conventions, my wife Jill comes over to me and goes, "David Morrissey's looking for you." I'm like, "What?" And I'm like, "Oh, fantastic. Okay." And she's like, "He's down at the end of the hall right now. Go down there." And so I go down there, and he's like this totally cool British dude who has a radio show. He's a rock DJ. He's like really funny. This goes back to my, at the beginning of this, talking about villains being such sweet people. And he's like, "Man, I did, I read yours and Robert's book. That was the only studying I did on that. I didn't read the comic book. I read that book. I mean, that was my preparation, is your book. It was an amazing piece of, preparation for an actor, because I got to read about the guy's, where he grew up, his brother, his dad, his job, his girlfriend, it was just amazing, man. And I based my role, I'm basing my work on that novel. And I'm like, this can't be happening, man. And I just became more and more friendly with a lot of the cast members and, the people on the show. And, you know, um, it just was, it was surreal. I wrote 8 books in 7 years, and I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I got to the point where Robert trusted me, and he sent me to Telltale Games to be a consultant on one of their games. And he go when he right before he does that, he goes, Jay, yeah, I was at Skybound in LA at the time, and he comes into the room I'm in, and he's like, Jay, can I see you later this afternoon? I have some news for you. And I'm like, yeah, news? Say, okay. So I went to see him, and he goes, you're gonna get your wish. And I'm like, well, okay. This was better than Santa Claus saying you're gonna get your wish. Kirkman goes, I'm gonna have you be a consultant on Telltale's next video game. It's called Michonne. I'm like, oh my God, you know, and it's, I worked on 2 games. I worked on a mobile game for them too. It was just incredible. It was an incredible experience. I'm sorry, I'm kind of,
No, 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 no. It's great. I don't want to keep much more of your time. You've been very generous with your time. Real quick though, what was the R story? Because you initially published with your middle initial, and then I guess you dropped it.
oh. Yeah, very good. Yeah. So when I started out and I started sending stuff to magazines, and got my first sale, which was for this little digest horror magazine called Gru. And Peggy Nadramia was the name of the editor. I'll never forget her. She's just a sweetheart. And so she bought my first story. So, she's the acceptance letter is like, yeah, your story's going to appear in our two issues from now. It'll be spring of, 89 or whatever it was. It was in the 80s. And she goes, and in case the JR initials, because at that time I even thought it looked sexier if I was called JR Bonansinga. And she goes, in case the JR initials conceal a feminine gender, we're having a special edition next year called Women in Horror. And I'm like, I send her back a response. I'm not a woman, but I could be one if I could get into that book. And from that moment on, I just thought I'm I'm going to use J, and the R initial though it still sounds, more elegant and writerly. And I don't even remember when I dropped the R. I don't remember why I dropped the R, but I guess I got more confidence in myself, and didn't need affectations at that point. But that's my R story.
Yeah. Perfect. So
Yeah.
Jay, thank you so much for hanging out. What if people want to stalk you online, where can they find you?
Well, it's easy to find me because I have a website, so it's jbonansinga.com. So it's just easy to find my website. But also, I have a fan page on Facebook, 2 pages on Facebook, one on X. It's pretty easy to find me. And I try to answer all the DMs that I get from fans, and you know a lot of times it's some guy going, in the Killers game, I read the movie tie-in, on page 73, you have a Ruger 22 caliber, and you call it a revolver. Everybody knows that's a pistol.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what, having, like
I
writing
bet
more
you
crime
dealt
and
with that.
thrillers, people, you cannot mess up guns. If
Right.
you mess up even like the,
Right.
just
I get
the,
that.
yeah,
I
anything
get it.
about guns, it has to be
Yeah.
100% correct or you're going to hear about it.
I get it. I get it. Even line editors at big time publishing houses don't really know their guns. I've noticed. They
Yeah.
let stuff, they're so good, but they let gun stuff slip through for some reason. I don't know. But yeah, yeah. I bet you have the same problem. I bet you get a
Right.
lot of gun corrections.
Yeah, I mean, one of my early straight up thrillers at the time, I didn't really, guns was very much like, I was like, okay, so like, I remember getting an email from a reader who basically was like, so I read this book of yours. I really, it was a fun read. I like the characters, but it's clear to me that you know nothing about guns. And he just gave me all these examples,
I
and
got that
I wrote him
same
back, and
letter.
I was like, you know what? I mean, that's fair. And so
Yeah,
I
I
ended up,
got
I
that
actually,
same letter.
this was one of the ones that I had, I had self-published. So I basically had complete control over it. I went back through it and just because at that point I was a little bit more conscious of certain guns,
Right,
I'd done a lot more
right,
research and I went through and I
right.
just made sure that everything was correct. And then from then on, I've just always been very like, checking things like 5 or 6 times before it goes to print. Even when we go through copy edits, just to make
I
sure,
bet.
like, okay,
Yeah,
this is all correct. Because,
yeah.
yeah.
I did it. I did a show for a program in Chicago called Wild Chicago, and they asked me if I would mind if they came along with me to the gun range because I told a couple friends and it got around to a person that had a connection to our local station, and I said I'm learning my guns next month, man. I'm going to the range. I got reservations, couple of visits. They're going to pull out every gun they have in stock for me. I'm going to fire, shotguns, Glocks, semi-automatics, big, small, and I did that. I did that. It was huge. It was a revelation, and I don't think I could have written the Killer's Game had I not done that, or at least had the verisimilitude if I had not done that. And they did a little comedy spot for their show with me on the range and everything. And they were like, "How's it feel, Jay? How's it feel to fire these guns?" And I'm like, "I think I'm getting hemorrhoids."
I think that's a perfect place to end it.
That's a perfect.
We're gonna end it there. So of course, the Killer's Game books or the book is back in print.
Yeah.
It's in ebook, audiobook, it's
Yep.
in paperback. You can find it in bookstores. The movie at this point, I don't think the movie's in theaters anymore, right? But you can
On
find it
Amazon.
streaming.
Yeah, it's on Amazon.
Yeah.
Uh, Great entertainment value.
And of course, you can check out all of other Jay's books online or if you can find
Thank
them in
you.
bookstores. And yeah, Jay, again, thank you so much for your time. It was good
My
talking to you.
pleasure,
Hopefully,
man.
we'll talk to you again in the
You
future.
know your
And for
subject.
everybody, yeah, and
You know,
everybody who checked in, we'll see you next time. Bye.
thank you.